The company that owns the Sun newspaper in the UK apologises to Prince Harry and gives him loads of money because of stories like this that they ran between 1996 and 2011. What does this big day in the British courtroom mean for that company and for the royals and for the law? We'll discuss all of that on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the studio, and shortly I'm going to be talking about matters international because there's quite a lot of global news, particularly about Russia and some intriguing maritime activity around the UK. But we'll do that in a second. First of all, let's dive into that big story that broke on Wednesday lunchtime in the UK, where Newsgroup newspapers settled with Prince Harry in his long legal battle against them. The settlement involves millions of pounds, we understand, but it also involved a quite long and detailed statement where Newsgroup newspapers made quite a lot of admissions and quite a lot of apologies to the Duke of Sussex. So let's talk about it now. We're joined by home and legal correspondent for the BBC, Dominic Casciani. Hello.
Hi, Adam. Hi.
Interesting day in court.
Yeah.
Interesting decade in court. And also Katie Razzall, media editor, is here. Hello, Katie.
Hi.
And I know you've got to go to an appointment, so which makes it sound very serious. I don't know why I said that. So if you need to go, please just go to do other media-related things.
Thank you.
Okay, so Dom, before we start, just so we're all on the same page here, what was this trial actually going to be about? If it had happened, what was it for?
Okay, 5 years in the making. Prince Harry's allegations of unlawful intrusion into his private life by journalists across Newsgroup newspapers' titles, which basically is The Sun and the News of the World. News of the World closed down in 2011. The NGN has long admitted wrongdoing at News of the World. That's why it closed it down, because it hacked people's phones, or journalists there hacked people's phones. That led to its closure in 2011. It's never admitted any wrongdoing on the part of The Sun. That's the core part of the case. The only other remaining claimant, Lord Tom Watson, former Labour MP, deputy leader of the party, he was bringing allegations that he'd been put under surveillance by the News of the World as he began to investigate in around 2009. But the most important part of this case was that both men were seeking to get a judgment on an overarching allegation that when you look at all the evidence in the round, just putting aside the specifics of their cases, there was a corporate-wide use of unlawful news-gathering techniques, private eyes, people blagging information, phone hacking and whatnot. And also that when the police started investigating seriously around 2011, that there was then a cover-up involving executives, and it went all the way to the top.
But Katie, there was then no trial, there were no witnesses, there was no judgment, there was no people in wigs making the case for or against. There was a settlement today with a load of money and a quite significant statement from Newsgroup.
It evaporated in quite a dramatic way because yesterday the trial was supposed to start, the case was supposed to start. Dominic was in court. I was watching it on a link, which is now what happens in open justice. You can get a link as a journalist to watch. We were expecting it to start, and instead there was delay upon delay upon delay, adjournment. The judge got more and more furious. He actually told the barristers at one point, no, you need to start this case. And they said, no, we're going to take you to appeal for not letting us have another adjournment. We all got wind then that something big was afoot, that looked most likely to be a settlement. And clearly they were up all night, these lawyers, on Newsgroup's side, on Prince Harry's side, on Lord Watson's side, hammering out the details of this agreement. So when the court case started again, with Dominic sitting in there and me watching it on the link with lots of other people, including possibly Prince Harry, we saw Prince Harry's and Lord Watson's barrister, David Sherborne, make this announcement that a settlement has been reached.
And we will parse the statement from Newsgroup newspapers because it's absolutely fascinating. But just paint a picture for what it was like there on the front line of this story, Dom.
Over the last 24 hours, it's been crazy, actually. I've spent days reading back into this because giving people an insight into how we have to do journalism. When you're doing these big stories which come and go from the courts, you walk away from it and then you then start to lose the detail. You can't keep everything in your head. So I spent 3 days rereading into this. And I thought, well, we haven't got the settlement yet, and I thought a settlement is as likely as Meghan Markle signing up to do a lifestyle column. Unfortunately,
For the Sun.
Unfortunately, I committed that to a blog on the BBC, and I've now been hoisted by my own Saki petard because that's where we've got to. What happened yesterday when we all arrived to the first day of this trial was there was a lot of nervousness in court. And it wasn't clear that things were ready. And normally on the opening day of the courts, everyone's a bit chipper, kind of like geared up, and everyone's kind of like this. And then Tom Watson arrives, and he looked like a rabbit caught in the headlights. That's quite unusual for a politician to sort of like look out of sorts. And we're thinking something's not quite right here. And then the lawyers began asking for adjournments, saying there are talks underway. And all of this was code that there's an agreement, in play, being hammered out. The judge was really annoyed with both sides because for months he's been saying you're failing to cooperate. You've either got to reach an agreement or run a trial properly. And he, at one point, he's referred to them as entrenched armies refusing to give an inch. And he really wanted them to crack on. And they pushed back very, very hard and said, we're not going to. We really want to basically continue these talks. And then the magic words came out. NGM's lawyers referred to a settlement dynamic, which is a marvellous bit of legalese, which basically said we're having talks. They've gone beyond talks about talks. We're actually in talks now. And we knew that was going on in the afternoon because I was sitting with some colleagues and we were trying to work out who was in which conference room on the 5th floor of the Rolls building of the High Court, which is a very lovely building. And we kept seeing shuttle diplomacy. You'd see one assistant go from one place to another, perhaps documents were being exchanged. I think the killer thing for me was when we saw David Sherborne, who's Harry's barrister, and Roddy Chisholm-Batten, who is Harry's personal solicitor. They left one conference room, dashed down a corridor to another conference room, kicked everybody else out of that conference room so they were the only two in there, and locked the door.
Right.
And I thought, that must be the hotline room to California.
Yeah.
And they then didn't come out for ages. And I think that was when they were trying to thrash things out with their client who, because of the time zones, was probably just out of bed. So we had all of that set up. And I got to court this morning and there were two takeaways. Everybody looked absolutely exhausted.
Because they've been up all night.
Right. But they looked really chipper. And
chipper on both sides.
Yeah. And that's very, very unusual. And that means there's a settlement in the air. And as David Sherborne came into court, we threw him a question saying, is there going to be a settlement? And he said, we'll have to see. And within minutes, we did.
It's all just happening in real time. Katie, we should explain that there's a reason in like how the law works in this case, and I mean the law as in the civil courts, because it's not a criminal matter, so it's not the law in that sense. That would encourage somebody to settle for a large sum of money, even if actually they weren't in it for the money, and even if they did want to have their day in court. It's kind of configured for you to not have your day in court.
Exactly. So the way it works is, and this is why. Well, News Group, we understand, has spent more than £1 billion on legal costs and settlements for all the people, or many of the people, who have alleged unlawful news gathering techniques against them by News Group newspapers. And that's The Sun and the News of the World. And yet all these people will remember Hugh Grant, Sienna Miller, all these people who said they wanted their day in court, but on the steps of the court, they actually said, we had to settle because we can't afford to take it forward. And that is because the way the law works, and it is, I mean, Dominic can explain it more, but it makes sense because you don't want to waste court time when you can get a settlement and get the parties to agree in advance. But it is essentially that you can be offered a sum of money by the other party. If you turn that sum of money down, even if you win in the court, if the damages awarded towards you or against you, towards you, are less than the settlement that you were offered, you are liable for the legal costs of both sides. And that is just prohibitively expensive, particularly in a court case like this, where we think that the legal costs were about £10 million. And we understand that Prince Harry and Lord Watson are not now paying either of their legal costs or, of course, News Group's legal
Basically,
costs.
fighting on can be end up being very, very expensive.
Absolutely. And yet, I had Chris Huhne, for example, on the media show earlier today, talking about he was one of the witnesses in this case. He had settled previously. They wanted it to go to court. He wanted his case to go to court. They all want to go to court to argue what they think is the sort of serious intrusion into their private lives by newsgroup newspapers, and yet none of them have been able to. And we always said, I've covered this case for so long on these cases, and we always say Prince Harry is going to be the last man standing because he's got the deepest pockets. But in the end, I suppose you could see it as every man has his price, or you could see it as he got the key things that he wanted out of newsgroup. And once he got that, he wasn't, there was no sense of going to court and then having to pay millions of pounds in legal costs.
And you can listen to Katie interviewing Chris Huhne, the former Liberal Democrat cabinet minister, on the Media Show, available now on BBC Sounds. That's the deal for getting you on our show.
Thanks, Adam.
Right, let's go through. Let's parse the statement that came from NGN today, because it's so interesting to read, and you can sort of sense a lot of the negotiations that went into the individual words. So why don't I read out a paragraph, and then you two can tell me why that's so important. Right, here's the first paragraph. NGN, so Newsgroup newspapers, offers a full and unequivocal apology to the Duke of Sussex for the serious intrusion by the Sun between 1996 and 2011 into his private life, including incidents of unlawful activities carried out by private investigators working for the Sun.
Right. Okay. That's the most important paragraph in this, and I'm going to claim I've got. Unfortunately, this isn't on tape, but I was in the pub last night with other legal reporters, and we were thrashing this out, what a settlement could say.
Right.
And we all broadly agreed the first sentence would read like that. Now, this is the important bit. They admit, there's a full and unequivocal apology for serious intrusion. They're not saying unlawful intrusion at that point. So they're admitting intrusion by the Sun. The date's 1996 to 2011, so that's the key period when Prince Harry says he was basically being hounded all the time. It covers when his mother was still alive all the way through to past his relationship with Chelsea Davy into his private life. And here's the key thing, including unlawful activities carried out by private investigators working for the Sun. Now, what's important there is that NGN are able to say it's the private investigators, but there's no admission in that sentence that journalists were involved in wrongdoing. And that leaves open the space for NGN, because the settlement has been accepted, to entirely reasonably say, this does not say our journalists were criminals.
Right, let's pause the parsing there, because Katie, you've got to go. But just before you do you want to just put today into kind of like the wider context of this decades-long saga of press intrusion, whether you want to call it phone hacking or the Leveson inquiry? Where are we now?
Well, everyone will remember, I certainly do, that dramatic day when we discovered that Millie Dowler's phone had been hacked. That was the murdered schoolgirl, exactly. And it led to such dramatic moves, the closure of the News of the World, it forced the Leveson inquiry in the end, it forced Rupert Murdoch and others to give evidence to Parliament.
He got custard pied.
Exactly, he got custard pied. Wendy Deng, his then wife, tried to save him, did save him, in fact, very dramatically. That was such a huge time. And it was still a time when the tabloids really mattered. They had power, they had influence. I'm not saying they don't have influence now, but it is just different. I mean, I'm going to talk about that image from the inauguration, bear with me, of, the tech bros, the tech titans. The influence has shifted, and we're now in a different era. So this is significant, and of course it's significant to Prince Harry, of course it's significant to all the victims, and of course it is still significant more widely, but it doesn't have the power, I would say, that it might have done all those years ago. And that is in part because these newspapers, yes, they do still have, influence over politicians, but not the way they did. Would you agree?
I think that's a really good way of summing up. I remember when the Millie Dowler thing happened, and just the gasp across all of the mainstream media that how could this actually happen? And then everything that tumbled out from that, including the criminal trials. And I sat through the entire criminal trial of Andy Coulson and Rebecca Brooks, and she was cleared of wrongdoing. And it felt like at the end of that trial,
Katie, I'm going to let you go.
Yeah.
But
Sorry,
Dom's doing his
apologies.
Professor Casciani bits, so I'll let you go.
No.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because I remember I was listening to George Osborne's podcast the other day there, and he was saying actually, and he was in conversation with David Cameron, and Osborne said he thought the closest the coalition government came to collapsing in the 2010s was over their response to the Leveson inquiry and a new press regulator, which is what we eventually got out of Leveson. Can we go back to the NGN statement though? Because I mean, it's as I said, it's worth looking at in detail. So I'm going to skip over the next two paragraphs.
Well, I think that middle paragraph, which mentions Diana, is really important.
Oh, yeah, okay. So that's the next one where it says NGN further apologises to the Duke for the impact on him of the extensive coverage and serious intrusion into his private life, as well as the private life of Diana, Princess of Wales, his late mother, in particular during his younger years. What's going on there?
That's the other thing that Harry wanted when you think about it. When a claimant goes to the court, they will chuck everything into their case, but their lawyers will say, what really matters to you? If we have to settle, what are your red lines? And I think what this statement shows that his red lines were he wanted an admission of intrusion, and I think he was probably a little bit flexible about whether that was defined as an unlawful intrusion or a serious intrusion, but he also wanted some acknowledgement about the harm to his mother and his personal life, his relationships. One of the things he says in his witness statement, which got somewhat lost, but we knew this a year ago, was that he blames tabloids for the breakup of his relationship with his first really serious girlfriend, Chelsea Davy. And no one knows if that relationship would have remained. But the point was, he felt she was hounded and she couldn't cope with it, and quite understandably said, "I don't want any part of your life." That part of the statement really goes to the heart of what Harry has felt has been so fundamentally wrong and has been done to him, and it also reflects what a lot of the other claimants, 1,700 claimants, have settled various cases for NGN. A lot of them will feel similar things. It's about the intrusion in their personal lives.
Well, also, you say it's the intrusion. I think the words that jump out there are extensive coverage, because that's not about techniques that some people might find unpalatable. That's just about the volume of stories, which is an editorial choice and a kind of like a kind of market editorial thing that was happening in that period. And that's very different from just criticizing phone hacking or hiring a private investigator to go through your bins or something. That's about the business model of the newspapers. Yeah. Right. Next paragraph that I want you to parse for me. Sure. They go on. We acknowledge and apologise for the distress caused to the Duke and the damage inflicted on relationships, friendships and family. That's the bit you were talking about. And have agreed to pay him substantial damages. We don't know what the number is, though, do we?
I'm fairly confident, right?
Millions.
I'm fairly confident that him and Lord Watson have got more than 10 million. That's damages. Well, it's a payout. You can't call it damages because damages is what the judge does. But it's a payout plus legal costs. Right, there is a lot of money. It's definitely into 8 figures, definitely.
Okay, then we're on to the next sentence of this fourth paragraph. It is also acknowledged, without any admission of illegality, that NGN's response to the 2006 arrests and subsequent actions were regrettable. Right, there is a lot to unpack there. So let's start unpacking. So first of all, no admission of illegality. They're not suggesting that they're not acknowledging that they broke the law or confessing to breaking the law.
So this relates to the first ever phone hacking allegation. In 2005, the Metropolitan Police began investigating whether Clive Goodman, the then royal reporter at the News of the World, had accessed voicemails belonging, mobile phones belonging to royal aides, basically aides around the two young princes to get stories about them. And that eventually led in 2006 to both Clive Goodman and a private investigator, Glenn Mulcair, being arrested, and they were charged and they pleaded guilty and were convicted and jailed in early 2007. Now, at the time, NGN's position was it was one rogue reporter. We had no knowledge of what was going on. And they stuck to that line, and critically, that line seemed to have been accepted by the palace. Now, because the News of the World was later closed down, after all the other allegations tumbled out, to the credit of Nick Davis from The Guardian, who spent a lot of time investigating this, that meant that one rogue reported defence was no longer tenable. So this is basically referencing what they said to the prince and his family and the royal household at the time.
Right. I mean, it's just a reminder of how many years this goes back. And of course, there was a phone hacking trial, wasn't there?
Yeah, 2014.
Andy Coulson, a former editor of the News of the World, who then went to go and work for Number 10 Downing Street under David Cameron, he went to prison after being found guilty of phone hacking.
Yeah.
But Rebecca Brooks, who is the current CEO of News Group newspapers, she was cleared of it in that criminal proceedings.
Yes, and that concerned stuff that went on at the News of the World. It didn't concern the Sun. By that time, Rebecca Brooks had moved from the News of the World to the Sun to the CEO. She became CEO of News Group in 2009. It solely focused on this period around what had happened in the early noughties around phone hacking at the News of the World, and Andy Coulson was implicated. He was convicted. Rebecca Brooks said she simply had no idea any of this was going on. Her hands were clean, and the jury accepted that and found her not guilty.
Right, and then there's a few more paragraphs in this statement relating to Lord Watson, but we've kind of got the gist of it now. So, and you can read the whole thing on the BBC News live page, and it's worth reading it as a kind of historical legal document. In terms of the future, what do Tom Watson and Prince Harry want to do with this now? Or are they kind of just satisfied? They're going to take the money. They've got the apology. They've got the acknowledgement that they've been seeking for years now. Is that kind of case closed?
Tom Watson, when he was outside court, looking mightily relieved, he was very clear that he wants more action on this. Yeah. And he doesn't just want action for action's sake. He says there is an opportunity here to go back and look at what has happened and reopen it. So the first thing is the second part of the Leveson inquiry. So the Leveson inquiry, as we know, looks into the practices. The second part of that inquiry, which was due to look at allegations of corruption in the media beyond sort of like the general ethics issues and you know specific allegations, it never happened. It got canned, and there seems to be no chance of that coming back at the moment. Tom Watson also says he's sending a dossier of evidence to Scotland Yard. And he's saying to the Commissioner, Mark Rowley, I want you to investigate. Look at what's happened in this case and what NGN has admitted to. Look at the evidence that we have had disclosed to us and look at what was said in the various inquiries to date and ask yourself the question about whether somebody somewhere has not told the truth or whether you, as the police, have missed an opportunity to investigate. And I think what's important about that is because this has gone on for 5 long years, and there's been 2 years of really, really bitter wrangling about preparing the Harry case, where there were constant demands saying we want more disclosure. Between Prince Harry, more documents, yeah,
being put in the open.
Yeah, what Prince Harry and Tom Watson have got is an absolute trove. I mean, literally thousands of pages of schedules which show things like private investigator ABC was paid this amount to gather this piece of information, which led, they say, to this particular headline. And it's that kind of stuff they want to have a look at, saying all these people are involved in unlawful activity. There are an awful lot of potential criminal charges. That's what they want the Met to look at. Now, whether the Met's got the energy to do so, we'll wait and see. I think a key issue in this, though, is also an issue of what's in the public interest and also what is fair to NGN figures. A lot of people have faced a lot of investigations so far. If you think about Rebecca Brooks, she was put through one criminal trial and cleared. So a key question for the police would be, is it really in the public interest, given these admissions today and the settlement, is it really in the public interest to take a figure like Rebecca Brooks and put her through all this again? And the law takes that stuff very, very seriously. It's not quite double jeopardy, but it's the case about
double
whether
jeopardy
or not
being the idea you can't be tried for the same crime twice.
Yeah, and that would never happen. But I think one of their concerns would be this is ancient history. Surely there is an argument this is all now settled.
And just very quickly, a spokesperson for the Met Police said, we're aware of the outcome of the civil proceedings. It remains the case there are no active police investigations into allegations of phone hacking or related matters. We await any correspondence from the parties involved, which we will respond to in due course. Also, Tom Watson said, there's now something for Keir Starmer to look at here as well if he wants to help the victims of the tabloid press. But I'm just not sure where the additional political pressure would come from in Parliament at the moment to kind of push Keir Starmer into something about this, unless he wants to, of course.
I mean, of course, the bigger question for the Prime Minister is what else has he got on his plate at the moment? And where does what feels like ancient history, where does that fit into that? I don't know.
Dom, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Now we're going to do the international half of this episode of Newscast, and we're going to start off by talking about a statement from the Defence Secretary about Russian military maritime activity off the coast of the UK, which caught our eye today. It also caught the eye of BBC diplomatic correspondent James Landale is here. Hello, James.
Hello.
Right, there's two stories to look at. Let's look at this intriguing statement we got today in the House of Commons from the Defence Secretary about some suspicious, as the government would describe it, maritime activity.
Yeah, look, there is a lot of sort of shadow boxing that goes on in our waters and international waters between the Russians and ourselves and other countries. And it has been going on for years. And a lot of it we never hear about. Occasionally, we see it because we'll see a ship, sort of a Russian ship going up and down. There's a great hulking old Russian destroyer that is, should have been got rid of years ago, that when you see it steaming up and down the channel, the amount of smoke pouring from its funnels is just, this is not a ship that could be used in any effective military operation, but the Russians still sort of use it
as a symbol.
But anyway, what's
we know where the UK is.
Yeah, exactly. And we have the Navy. Because remember, the key point, of course, is that Russia's Navy, a large part of it, is either trapped inside the Black Sea or it's not allowed in because of the rules that the Turks have, and they control the Bosphorus, and they won't let anybody in at the moment. So there's a lot of Russian ships sort of wandering around, hoping they would like to be in the Black Sea, but they can't. Anyway, what's happened is that there is a Russian vessel called the Yantar, and the Russians call it an oceanic research vessel. And the Navy call it a spy ship, a Russian spy ship. Anyway, this was being monitored by British naval vessels. And what the new fact that we've heard and learned about today, because of the statement given by the Defence Secretary, is that it was also being shadowed by a submarine, a British submarine, and that submarine surfaced next to the Russian vessel and started giving it a ticking off and started, sort of communicating with it, saying, we see you, we know what you're doing. Now, what is interesting about this is that this is a more aggressive response than we see. Normally, there's just a sort of monitoring and everybody knows where they are. But for a submarine to reveal itself and suddenly surface and go,
well, it's normally one of the most secret things ever, the location of our submarines.
Yeah, and you certainly don't suddenly sort of, announce yourself. However, this is part of a continuing strategy the government has with pushing back against the Russians with their, the grey activity, the grey aggressions, it's called, whether it is cyber or criminal activities or, even extreme things such as, the Salisbury attacks. There's an increasing trend now to try and push back about this by calling out the Russians. In other words, making what they're doing public. It's not a totally effective strategy, but it is one that the British government and other governments believe has an impact. And I think that's what they're doing here, surfacing a submarine, having a statement in Parliament, things like that.
And the second thing that jumps out of this statement is the kind of accusation about what this Russian ship might have been doing, which is looking in depth, if you pardon the pun, at kind of undersea infrastructure, like important cables, whether it's electricity, data, which is a kind of a new focus when it comes to kind of like the international chessboard of where you can get people.
And you say chessboard, I would say battlefield. The surface of the ocean littered with these extraordinarily important cables that allow us to do everything from, communicate on really important things or order things online. It all happens on the seabed now. And there have been incidents in recent months of Russian ships accused of dragging their anchors, for miles and miles and miles just to damage these communications cables, power cables, and the rest of it that are on the seabed. And that is a place now where navies are having to reconfigure to try and work out how to defend about them. There are more ships now monitoring, especially the Baltic, because that is a key part of this battleground. So in recent years, naval focus has been about projection of power around the world with these massive, great aircraft carriers. We've built 2 of them at huge expense, controversially, and yet actually there's a lot more naval warfare now, which is smaller scale, about monitoring and about deterring actual acts of military piracy by damaging infrastructure that's on the bottom of the sea.
And it's interesting because every couple of months, a government minister will make a speech or do something about this idea of resilience, because it's a potential weak spot.
Resilience, I'm surprised we don't have a resilience minister. In other countries, they do, because it's everything from, supply chains of pharmaceuticals that become important during pandemics, such as we discovered in COVID. It's about reducing supply chains so that we can make sure that we can feed ourselves, we can give ourselves energy, all of that entire agenda. But resilience is also a cultural thing. It's also about trying to change the mindset of the public so that they are aware that Britain is in a state of conflict with Russia. Russia is the generational threat, and I go to endless events where I'm told that, and yet it's one of those things where you sometimes think the penny hasn't quite dropped with many people, just the scale of the threat, and that's why there's an interesting political debate about this, which is that there are many people who believe, in my sort of foreign policy world, that we are going to have to, as a nation, spend more on defence. This is not just sort of, a debating point, and it's not just something that, we're being pushed into by Donald Trump, but actually the UK and other European nations are just going to have to spend more. And it is going to require incredibly painful choices. But the point is that the political argument for that is sort of lagging at the moment, and that our politicians are not making that case of the scale of the threat and that needs to be done. Now, that's not a political point. That's just something that, that I go to a lot of events where people just say this.
Well, it's interesting because it's reminding me of a conversation we had on Newscast a few months ago with Fiona Hill, the Russia expert who now lives in the US but is British and is 1/3 of the wise people doing Labour's defence review. And she was talking about resilience a lot in that conversation. And yeah, resilience at a population level, in that it's something we all have to do rather than just having a submarine popping up behind a Russian spy ship every now and then to keep an eye on what they're doing with our cables. So more on that in the next few months. Right, 2 Russia stories in one day. Donald Trump has made his first statement about the Ukraine conflict. He's posted it on Truth Social, his social media network. And interestingly, it's not really about Ukraine. It's about Russia, and it's a message to Vladimir Putin about the Russian economy.
It's really interesting. He said nothing about Ukraine in the inaugural speech, but directly by name.
Other than saying he wanted to be a peacemaker.
He wanted to be a peacemaker, and he wanted to, be known for the wars he stopped and the wars he prevented and things like that. So then he said 2 things. One was in the Oval Office yesterday, where he started having a go at Vladimir Putin, saying, why is he doing this war? It's damaging Russia. Russia's really suffering from all of this, which was sort of cautionary note. And then today he's gone even further and threatened to impose taxes, tariffs and sanctions, no specifics, on Russia if it did not come to the table. So in other words, he's beginning to ramp up the sort of the oral threats and the rhetoric against Vladimir Putin. Now, this is all the sort of beating of the drum ahead of some kind of meeting conversation that is, we think, going to happen at some time in the future. He says, the president, that, a meeting with Mr. Putin is being arranged. He doesn't know when it's going to happen. But this is part of the sort of build up to that moment when we're going to see, I think, one of the first tests of, is there a limit to the power of Donald Trump? Is Vladimir Putin willing to engage in conversations, to come to the table, to actually start discussing Ukraine's future, or is he not?
Let me just read out some of the post, actually, so people know what we're talking about. So it starts off by saying how much he loves Russia and refers back to the Second World War and how many Russian lives were lost fighting Hitler. And then he gets into the economic bit and he says, addressing President Putin directly, he says, settle now and stop, capitals, this ridiculous war. It's only going to get worse. If we don't make a deal, in inverted commas, and soon, I have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries. Let's get this war, which never would have started if I were president, over with. We can do it the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is always better. It's time to, all capitals now, make a deal. No more lives should be lost. Multiple exclamation marks. I mean, back to your point about taxes, tariffs and sanctions. I mean, there's already quite a lot of sanctions on Russian economic activity, and I can't imagine there's a huge number of imports from Russia into the US at the moment that you could put a tariff or an import tax on. So it's just, I suppose, it goes back to your point that this is positioning rather. He's not announcing some new economic policies when it comes to Russia, really.
I mean, look, we can get into deep psychology of what possibly could influence Vladimir Putin to come to the table. But essentially, the sort of place we're going to have to get to is something like America threatening to increase substantially the amount of military and financial aid it gives to Ukraine in a way that would meaningfully change the reality on the battlefield, that could increase the cost of the war, so that Putin thinks actually maybe now's the time to actually have a discussion about ending it.
And presumably that's what Trump means when he says we could do this the easy way or the hard way.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, we simply do not know yet. I mean, it's entirely possible that Trump and Putin meet and they have lots of discussions and they talk about a peace deal, but then it collapses at the end. In the end, the Ukrainians might end up getting the blame rather than the Russians. So we simply don't know how this is going to pan out. There's a long way to go. But clearly what we're seeing in this today is, Trump just beginning to beat the drum, just beginning to get the message. So if you think about it, pre the inauguration, and look, whenever he spoke about Ukraine, it was always about putting pressure on Ukraine.
Yeah.
And sometimes, he would echo Russian talking points by saying, well, I think that they had a point. NATO was expanding. No, there's not the message. Whereas we haven't heard that now, which is why a lot of people are saying that Zelensky is playing a really clever game here at the moment, and thus far is showing the best way of approaching the arrival of the return of Donald Trump. Zelensky's speech yesterday to the Davos crowd was absolutely
the World
fascinating.
Economic Forum,
the World Economic
with all the
Forum.
CEOs.
He basically read the riot act to the Europeans and said, look, if Trump says 5% of NATO spending, well, so it is. Don't come to me talking about health and pensions, because that's not fair. Which is what people tend to say. So, well, we'd have to cut health, we'd have to cut pensions. And he said, look, if Europe wants to survive, wants to remain alive, it has to become more relevant. And in other words, he was making, Donald Trump's talking points to the Europeans. And that is very much a message, I think, that would resonate within Washington.
Now, very quickly, just before I let you go, I just wanted to show off some research I've done about the Panama Canal. This was inspired by Johnny Diamond on Monday's episode talking about the history of the Panama Canal. And I was looking at the kind of the Jimmy Carter archive online, and they were talking about the treaty that he did with Panama in the 70s to maintain US access to the Panama Canal and how it would be neutral. And so he did these negotiations with the then leader of Panama, who wasn't the most kind of legitimate guy. And he thought he'd done the deal. And then the Jimmy Carter website's like, but then he came back to Congress and it turns out Congress didn't like the deal. And he ended up having to basically renegotiate the deal via Congress to get it through. And I just thought, Theresa May's Brexit deal. This happens every time, doesn't it? You do your deal with your opposite number, and then you have to sell the deal back home. And it quite often doesn't work.
Is that the first time Panama and Brexit have been mentioned in the same breath?
Certainly this week.
I've actually been through the Panama Canal.
Have you? Because Johnny was making out he was probably the only person in this building who had.
No.
What's it like?
It's deeper than you think. It's darker than you think. And it has these funny little engines that take the ropes so that as you're going through, you tie your rope to these little sort of like little trains on tracks that sort of help you sort of go through. It takes a long time. What else do I remember from it?
The fact that it's above sea level.
Yeah, and also it actually goes west-east rather than east-west because of the geography. Look at your map. Look at your map. It actually goes that way. And also, of course, most of it is a sea. Not all of it is a canal because there's a big sort of lake in the middle. And you know what? The place, when you go into it on the eastern side of it, you stop off at a place called Colón, and it's like a sort of it has a real Wild West feel to it as a town, very much like the town in the first Star Wars, where
Mos Eisley,
where they find Han Solo for the first time. It has a sort of real sort of because this is where it's one of those sort of port sort of transit places, people going like that. It'll be a great place to set a spy movie,
or perhaps James Landale to do a report from in the next few months. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's a very international note on which to end this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye.